Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Halil Fariza, FPMD 235101312. Di sini saya akan menyimak video dari Rekhox yang tutorial tahun 2025. Selamat menonton.
Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you guys every single React so far on my channel. And the reason why I wanted to remake this is because that video was made 3 years ago and I didn't even cover every single hook, and as of 2024 I deprecated, enjoyed my last one. My purpose of the entire video at once. If you ever want to refine your skills or the video part for that hook in this video description I am right now, so I would really appreciate the support that you guys can give me. So into the tutorial. Okay everyone, so let's get started. Before I get into our first hook, which is going to obviously be the use state hook, the most simple hook that you can learn in React, I want to explain a little bit about how I'm going to structure this code base in case you want to just follow the examples by going to the code base in the description. How I structure this is I have this folder over here called hooks, and inside of it we'll have the example I'm using in the video for each of the individual hooks, also accompanied by any files that I use for the examples. So if you're interested in just checking out the use ID example, you can click on it and go in there. But in our case, we're going to start with the use state hook. And the way this file is structured is obviously just empty in the beginning, but we'll be including them in our app component as we go through the video, just to show them on our right over here. So let's get started with the use state hook. So if you are a complete beginner in React, you definitely heard of this hook, but I feel like this tutorial might help you even if you have already used the useState hook multiple times, in the sense that I will explain to you guys right from the beginning what's the purpose of a state, why you don't directly just get the DOM elements and edit their HTML directly like you would with normal vanilla JavaScript. States are the fundamental building blocks of a React application. Now, the example I want to use for the state here is the most simple example that I believe is used for describing states, which is the idea of building a counter. So in this component over here, I'm going to put a div, which is going to wrap a p tag, so a paragraph tag, which is going to display some number, which is going to be the count. Then we want to have a button over here, which is going to interact with that number by increasing its value. So we'll say increase counter for the count, and we have no functions to call when you click the button. Before we create any state, let's just do it how we would normally do with a normal variable, as if you were playing around with JavaScript. I'll create a constant over here. Actually, I'll create a normal variable that can be altered, and I'll say count is equal to 0, and then I'll pass this value over here by passing count. Perfect. You see, now we see the count being 0. On this button over here, I'll create a variable called increase count, and this increase count as the on click to this button. Perfect. Now, normally speaking, if I want to make this variable go up, right, this value go up by 1 each time, what I could technically do is do count plus or equals 1. But you'll see that this doesn't work. Now, it technically increases the value. If I were to console log over here the value of count, you'll see that in our console over here, it should technically, when I click the first time, show 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So the variable count is indeed changing. But why aren't we seeing that change over here? Well, because if you were using vanilla JavaScript, what you would do now is you would directly grab whatever p tag is displaying this number and change its value to represent the variable. But we're not doing that. We're using React, where our DOM needs to be updated and re-rendered automatically depending how the state of our application is. So this is the idea of a state. A state, in its most simplest form, is just a variable that you can create and change its value, and when its value is changed, it will automatically trigger a re-render of your page to demonstrate the new value. So how do we create one? Well, the way you do it is like this. You say const and then set an open and closing square brackets. Then you set it equal to the useState hook. It should automatically import it from React. Then we open and close parentheses, and you'll see that most hooks will look a similar way. Now, what do you put over here? Well, you put the initial value of what your state what you want your state to be. But this, if that's the case as well. So we'll keep it as 0 is defined, and you can look inside of here. Well, with the way that the useState hook is defined, and you can look at it if you want to, this should return back inside of here two things. The first is the value of your state, which is being called, you can call it whatever you want, let's call it count. And then it is a function that you can use to alter the state. So we're going to call this set count. Usually it has this notation with set in front and then usually the name of the state. But why do we need a function to change it? Because although this count variable is actually working similar to how it was before when we were using let, you'll see that altering the value of it by just increasing it like this doesn't work. Because what you have to do is use this set count function and mutate the value inside of it. So we'll replace this over here and we'll open and close parentheses to call this set count function. Now, what do I mean by mutating this value? Well, this function inside of it. So a function that gives you access to the previous value of the state. So if count is 0 initially, the first time we call this prev value over here will be equal to 0. Now, if we increase it by 1, the next time prev will be equal to 1. So what we return from this function is just the new value of our state with this alteration. So when we call increase count, all we want to do is get the previous value and increase it by 1. If we wanted to decrease it, we could subtract or multiply or do whatever we want with this. But in our case, we want to just add it. And by doing this, we'll ensure actually trigger a re-render. Now, if I keep more about the React lifecycle, we see that initially it's supposed to be 0, and we're not console logging initially. We only console log when we click increase count. So we are setting the count to be equal to 1 over here as the first touch of the button, and then we're console logging. So you should assume that when you click at this, that it's always lagged behind. It seems like it will always be 1 behind, even though it's after the set count. And the reason for that is because we're console logging before the page decides to re-render to show the new state value. And thus, the state actually only changes value after it's done running this increase count function. So you'll see what will happen over here. It increases by 2 each time, but it also lags behind on both of them. See? So this is the most basic explanation of the useState hook. It will be the hook that we use for most of our other examples because it's basically the most simplest way of managing the state of your application in React. Now, there's other examples that you can play around with, but I think that this should be enough to get you going to the next ones. Okay, everyone. Now let's go into the useEffect hook, which is the second most basic hook in React, in my opinion. So I changed a bit the app.jsx that we had before. Instead of showing the state example, I'm showing the effect one. So if you're playing around with the code base, I would ensure that you do the same. So powerful hooks in React, even though it gets a lot of backlash, especially nowadays. And as a beginner, you will mostly use it for doing stuff like fetching data from an API immediately when your page renders. So what the useEffect hook does is it lets you run code after the component renders, depending on a set of circumstances. So if I had a state, for example, and I wanted to run a function every time that state changes value, I could use a useEffect for that. If I wanted to run a function I could use a useEffect for that. Now, how is that going to look like? Well, the example I want to give to you guys is the idea of fetching data from an API immediately when you go inside of the website. Now, I'm going to be using a public API that you guys can access. It is the JSON placeholder API. It just returns fake data for users. And in this case, we're accessing data for like some posts. So like as if you're in Facebook making some posts. But the idea is that we want to go into our website over here, and when I first render the page, I want to run a function that will fetch this data and display it in my screen. Now, keep in mind, doing this inside of a use effect is one of the methods you're going to be using a use effect for the most as a beginner. But as you grow older in your React journey, you'll see that there's more effective ways of doing this kind of fetching data by using stuff like a response. But let's get into actually building the use effect to do that. Well, the first thing we need to do is have a way to display that data. So I'm actually just going to display the data of the posts by creating an h1 tag over here, saying posts, and below it, I want to have an unordered list from this individual post, right? Hook. Perfect. You saw it also auto-imported over here. The hook, always obvious, will execute whenever your use effect is supposed to. So whatever action information you put over here, like console log page rendered, you'll see that it will actually console log over here. It runs twice because of some of the inner workings of React, where it basically overreacts once, fetch some data. But there's one last thing that we have to do to make this use effect work. We have to add something else, which is a dependency list. Now, what is the dependency list? Page renders. Once, if there's no once, like use effect or this its value, then there are multiple reasons why you might want to put just its value, and you could put that state as part of the dependency list. But in the case where we only want to run this once when the page renders, we want to keep it empty like this, right? So I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna say fetch API link over here, and I'm gonna actually use promises in this tutorial. So I'm gonna say then I'm going to say, I'm going to grab the response from this .then, and I want to turn that into its JSON format. And then I'm going to put another .then that will convert this into actual data. So I'll grab the JSON, and I want to do something with that data. Right, JSON, the log over here with all of the data from the API. But how do we display it in our component? Well, we need to use what we learned in the previous hook, which is the useState hook, and utilize a state for this, because we want to have a variable in which when its value is changed, which means whenever we're done fetching the data, we want to re-render the page to show its value. So I want to come over here and I want to create one state for the data that we get back from the API. So we'll say data and set data. And inside of this useState, we need to put an initial value. So this will return a list of posts. So the initial value for this will be an empty list. Perfect.
AI is changing.
To instead of just console logging the JSON we get from the API, delete this list value, and in this item, you see it already shows the 100 list items that we got, but we haven't actually displayed any data from them. But inside of here, we'll literally just see how the JSON data is formatted. It has a title with the actual title of the post, and the actual data updates to show that information. So do any actions. It runs when the page renders for the first time. Now, what about that dependency list that we talked about? Well, the best way I think to explain to you guys about this dependency list is to create log the name Pedro. Now, what will this do? Well, I want to console log the name Pedro every time another kinds of show Pedro and set show Pedro. This will be a Boolean. So it will start as false button that will actually, I want to basically opposite of what it is, right? So if it's true, dependency list does. So by setting the value of the set show Pedro equal to the true. Now let's console log the word Pedro a couple times. In this case, it does twice. Now, why does it do twice? Well, it does on the first render of the page, it does twice on the first render, like we said, but I haven't put a dependency list over here, meaning that every time any state in this component changes the list, because if I want this to only render whenever this, like whenever this is the first render, then it will show twice. So trigger show Pedro state. Well, the name is already there. I can just put this effect as you go. There's a not to events because I experience, scribe, and clean up into socket, and you can then use the video. I do have a more. This is all I wanted to cover for this hook. Now let's talk about one of the most important hooks in React, especially when you're starting your journey and you want to learn how to build applications that can actually scale and manage your states, which is the use context hook. Now, to make this example, I actually already built the context example component that we have over here because I want to showcase you guys the use case of the use context hook by first showing you guys an example of what problem it fixes. Component, which is called the context. There's a state called isToggle over here, which starts off as false, but depending on its value, it will show is by clicking a button that exists on the parent component. So to actually access that in play, I need to access props, information. This would need prop as well, arguably, but I didn't need to have this prop through this of how it is set up right now. You would have to do that. But it also can cause a lot of unnecessary re-renders of components. Because remember, if I'm passing something as prop, that means that every time that value is changed, it would trigger a re-render of this component. Meaning that even components that don't need to be re-rendered do this. How do you make it such and store that contains all the states from this component? Well, that's where the use context hook rewrite it. But as you learn more and more about React, there are countless others libraries and so React query them out recommended. So how would we make it such that we don't have to pass this information as props? Well, the first thing we want to do is create what is known as a context. So I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna call it const, and I'll call it the global state context. So I can call it whatever I want, right? Usually you call it depending on the context. But in this case over here, I want to make it such that all the components below this will have access to the state. So I want to make the state be global. So I'm going to call this create context by using the create context function from React. Now, I won't pass anything over here. I can pass null if I want to, but this won't matter. What matters is that now I can use whole text that I created and wrap it around this whole context example component that I have. I can pass in the global state context and press dot and make a provider out of it. Now, a provider is like you're telling React which components you want to provide this global context to. So everything that exists inside of here will have access to the composition of states that you want to put inside of this context. Now, how do you put the states inside of here? Well, you pass a value. One thing set is toggle function. Those are the only two things that we multiple states they want to have to be accessed globally. You can also include them inside of this object over here. Now, this means that I can just delete both of these props. Sorry. And from here as well. Because now, if I want to access both the set is toggle and the is toggle, and you will grab values from a context that you provide it with. So const out of here, the set is toggle, I'll display. You'll see that the quantity of states that I create and call inside of here, taking all of this for this all of those files, and inside of it, everything that this wraps around. Now, again, command learning more in Redux. Okay, everyone, we just finished, I believe, where we're learning a bit of the additional ones, where it's not the end of the world if you don't. This is probably multiple reasons for just something like And if you're from a lot of people, it is not technically required. I believe just using states can also be a good thing as well. So the best way to explain this is by putting a situation here in the screen in which we are using a use state. So I brought back the example from the counter. It was broken use, and it will execute at the prep multiply time. Well, see the use over here, port over here at the top, and we'll just place it over here. Now the use reduce things that are returned behind it, state, and the state will represent the count when we create our reducer function. The set, and we also want to pass an initial value for our reducer. So we want to pass an initial 0, and we'll create and things a state of your reducer. If we state dot count at any time. Now, what is the action? Well, when you want to change this state and any part of it, you can this function will just dispatch an action and we'll give it a type. For example, in this case, it's the increment action because we're incrementing. So we're not actually handling the logic of increasing or decreasing or doing anything inside of this. We're going to do all of that inside of this reducer function. And if I want to subtract, I could do the exact same thing, but by calling a dispatch of type decrement over here. Where will we handle this? Well, we'll handle it over here that exists. So it's actually action type. So we'll come over here. We'll pass in we'll check turn. So we have this equal to state, and this should go back. So on the decrement, we'll just change this to -1, and on the double, we'll just multiply this times 2. Perfect. Technically work. And we need to say state.count. And we should see that this does work. Which an alternative to the use specifically also acts pretty was for a user might want to be manipulating a single function. One thing to handle the case in which you accidentally dispatch something that doesn't exist. Yeah, you see breaks. So we want to put console log no reduce. Now what happens is, even though the name is over here, we want to handle that case. It doesn't really matter. I just wanted to add it because you don't want to have a switch case without a default to default to. So now we're going to talk, in my opinion, you can use main purpose can store created in different things. If you ever previous of states, but like store the previous graph, it's used to make your component elements input. So type is to make a direct reference property. Want to create a function, the function input button. Grab the current text piece ref you to see the current inside of it with a re-render, and we'll see that. But input ref, people love to point the HTML and console log current. When I click on, so this is a I represent Pedro, and say remember the use effect. If I were to create a use, we're not. This is the main two use cases of that will display increase 1, and we'll increase this through this whole years. Value of the state was before. To get to 11, it had the purple variations. What I can do is every time so I'll say to use initial count. This will say previous count. Now count the current value we set an actual variable. Now when I click increment, you'll see that the count goes up, but the previous count doesn't. Changes, we want to set equal to the previous mediate without actually causing issues like re-rendering. The best and the DOM element of your component ordered hooks in React, you want that you'll use. I also where I need hook as a whole part of use case. Feel free to do so. Typing everything will probably give a worse explanation. So I already built up an example, and I also actually basically allow, and it's very control exactly. And easiest way I think is it's basically a way for you to decide what the parent can see and do to a child's a parent component. And in our case, it's the imperative handle example that we are displaying here in the screen. Want to have buttons that doubts to focus on. You might have noticed, but and the we do this. Well, you create the a ref, which I import. We want to have access to big use case for component to have handle function. Like we said, which can make your project more organized. We'll go over the repaints the use the before you paint the screen. So in this example box, I'll actually paint, but it's a button, and I don't know why that happened. But yeah, or we the user it was information a element, or all of that is and accurately the correct information, or they having it is good element element and avoid flip the use layout. Use effect would get the because everything and you should see it. And the component won't there be thousand paint to the screen basically and that effect when and your look effect but and size out the next that uses CSS styles and don't do that we talked about because around 3 or 4 free to do that runs synchronous. You need to insert style. So you can see that you're off using the this is what I'm using the renders, but this is used in all of this very beneficial and a with browser style ported. I think this explanation is from the able to use, and this is very well other libraries that does some sort of work. I can just should give so I'll put another very but use elements outside of a map where like the key to just see like really easy to act has to with that if you are a button or smooth important filtering here which is but word item and we're able because there's 10,000 items but it because calculate right book my update filtered items position hook one because typing you'll start seeing the loading screen prioritize showing the loading because if I wasn't doing it just require that I use it a good amount it keeps or I a code I don't now if you're a beginner and less attention to the important work which is in this case a complex and hard thing is being done in the background. So I personally think it's especially useful hook. This hook is extremely my example as if the app has time to process it. Meaning that the use transition hook where you had to from an API doing is just with the use transition hook, right? Now the list. This query to create a I'll defer this value now like when we have the default so we can just for when you're dealing with complex like it still be one is a value frequently the value most useful ones I think from the because that's that simple component Pokemons. Now we're gonna change this hook to be using the useSync external store but in order to do that I want to just explain a little bit about what this hook is. Well, the useSync external store hook is designed to let components be able to subscribe to custom introduce situation state you need is inconsistent like this how the hook actually external store. And you can also option subscribe function so we'll have to create that which will tell you which will register during the current state which is a function meant for have over here from the store so that another and I'll call it here I'm going to create the things that I need I'll remove we'll create a state from this the list the state a sync over here one thing here So instead of saying set Pokemons, what we can do after equal result, the subscribe to this, which contains all action and the state of our store. Actually, I'll call it over here the fetch Pokemon function, and we'll just have a normal use effect that we'll call it on the first render. So we'll just call it over here, and I'll put the dependency list for us. Now, the great thing about this is that any other component hook and handle all of this automatically without having to write all of this released, but it's great because it keeps state management separate from the store, even if you're in the situation of concurrent render. Just grab using the use, or like I said, whilst the use context hook and creating a context, its main purpose is something else. It's sharing state and data across a component tree. Now, you can indeed do something similar using either of those, but we're exactly optimized for React's concurrent rendering, and it will avoid unnecessary re-renders. Whilst the use context, every single component that in cases my store component, because the use sync external store components only update when the store changes, whilst in the use context hook, the context triggers up hand to hand with sharing like the theme of your website. In this case over here, sources, something like the sync external store might be. Really appreciate if you guys could thank everyone for watching this video. This was a lot of work, and I would really appreciate if you guys could leave a like and turn the notification bell on.
Oke, itu saja dari saya. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.